Greetings YouTube, welcome to the Consoletronix Mausoleum, as today we explore the lineage of the foremost family of fearless vampire killers, the Belmonts. Because no matter how many times the Lord of Darkness, Count Dracula, has risen from his grave to plague humanity, there has always been a heavily armed branch of the Belmont family tree to drive a wooden stake through his plans. And like the family, their adventures would be multi-generational sagas, beginning on the 8-bit NES to spiritual successors such as Koji Igarashi's bloodstained Ritual of the Night in 2018. And with the recently released Castlevania Anniversary Collection bringing this series back with a well-received bundle of retro classics, what better time then to look at gaming's greatest gothic horror in my Castlevania series review. The name Konami is one that elicits many emotions in gamers today, but back in the late 1980s with the Western release of their hugely popular Akumajo Dracula, Konami's reputation as one of the elite NES developers was assured, their fame even being felt far away in Sega country, where Master System owners such as myself looked on in a combination of disbelief and denial as we tried repeatedly to convince ourselves that Master of Darkness was just as good as the now renamed Castlevania platform masterpiece, and would no doubt, with the passage of time, eclipse Konami's franchise. Ah, the naivety of youth. Crafting a follow-up to such a successful game that pleases old fans while being accessible to newcomers would seem like a Herculean assignment to most developers, but to Konami at this time, it was just another Monday morning, as they couldn't make a bad game if they tried. And while a lot of the new features, such as the passage of day to night, were welcomed at the time, the limitations of the hardware more than anything else hinders a brave effort to balance the platform action with more RPG style elements, a frustrating start to the more exploration driven direction for which the franchise would become known for. The first Castlevania game I would see up and running, and what an introduction to the series. Having tried something new with part 2, this time rather than trying to fix problems that didn't exist, Konami would instead just make the first game 10 times better. And just to hammer home that point, they have you play the original game at the beginning, before breaking you in easy to what can only be described in those infamous words, NES game difficulty. But persevere you must, as this is an awesome experience, and one of the many 8-bit must-have masterpieces that the NES had in abundance. With the release of the Super Famicom in Japan in 1990, gamers the world over sought out every juicy tidbit of 16-bit information they could get from magazines. Unfortunately, we in the UK would have to wait until the summer of 1992 before we could get our sweaty mitts on Nintendo's newest console and a copy of Super Castlevania 4. And playing this game for the first time honestly felt like Konami had just been killing time with the 8-bit and Game Boy installments, because this game had no right to be this good, and all these years later I still come back to it, a true classic.
Courage. Don't leave me.
Oh boy. Now, interestingly, at the time of Castlevania's first step up into 3D gaming with this Nintendo 64 exclusive in 1999, Konami would say that they needed the extra horsepower of the N64 to do it because the PS1 couldn't handle whip physics, although I thought they'd cracked it just fine on the NES. But even the godlike coders of Konami can have an off day, I suppose. And so a year later, they would atone for their sins with the much better, well, slightly better follow-up, Castlevania Legacy of Darkness. But why release the below par original in the first place? Well, the more conspiracy-minded out there have a few theories for that, such as Konami being under contract to produce them despite not wanting to. And while there may be no truth to that, it's well known that then Nintendo president Hiroshi Yamaguchi hated RPGs, so happily let Square leave and take Final Fantasy VII to Sony after announcing it would come out on the N64, but made Konami honour their agreement. And the more I learn about Yamaguchi and his business practices, I wouldn't be surprised if it was true. Well, let's cleanse our palate of that N64 polygon rubbish and take a look at Castlevania as God intended. 2D and frigging sensational. This is the rarely talked about Sega Saturn version, which, like a lot of the system's best games, never left Japan. But whether you play it on PS1, Xbox 360 or in any number of compilations it's appeared in, just play it. It is, when all's said and done, the definitive 2D Castlevania game, even if the Saturn port is sadly inferior to the PS1 version. Sometimes before taking 2 steps forward, you have to take a step back and survey the scene. So after the poorly received N64 games, the franchise would look to create a niche for itself on handheld with a trilogy of Game Boy Advance adventures. This is the third, Castlevania Aria of Sorrow, which kept my idle hands busy shortly after the turn of the century. A small screen triumph which doesn't get the respect it deserves. Seriously, check it out. After proving to everybody that the traditional Castlevania 2D formula was as potent as ever on handheld, the big question on fans' lips was, could Konami finally make a fully 3D entry that could rival not just the Devil May Cry's and Gods of War, but the high standards of its own franchise? The answer came with Lament of Innocence in 2003, and while a very good game in its own right, it caused quite a bit of controversy in Japan. Not due to censorship issues which Westerners had to put up with on Nintendo, but because Konami dropped the Akumasho Dracula title for the first time, giving this PS2 title the Castlevania name worldwide, but due to the backlash, quickly changed back again. Despite not putting a foot wrong with the Castlevania series up to this point, with the exception of not realising how passionate their Japanese fans were, one could be forgiven for thinking that the series was getting a little samey. The last big deviation in the franchise was with Kid Dracula in 1990, so Konami would look to tinker with its canon in Castlevania Judgment for the Nintendo Wii, a fighting game with a roster of characters from the now long-running property. A lightweight effort if I'm honest, and one most don't even know exists, but worth a punt. For a while, Konami would struggle with what to do and with what direction to take with the Castlevania franchise on console. On handheld, however, they just kept knocking it out the park. The 3 GBA games were fantastic. Could they really maintain that high level on the DS? Oh ye of little faith. Another trilogy of unequalled majesty later, and while a lot of fans found them a little gimmicky, I have yet to meet the man who had a single issue with the first DS game, Dawn of Sorrow. For the love of God, play this game!
These are dark times. Times without hope.
I mentioned that Konami were unsure how to handle Castlevania on console, so in the end, farmed out development duties to Mercury Steam, who did such a bang-up job on Clive Barker's Jericho, it made them the obvious candidates to update the aging Castlevania franchise. And in case you can't tell, I was being sarcastic. Also, the masterful and manly hands of Koji Igarashi are noticeably missing, but in his place would be another Konami old boy, Hideo Kojima, who acted more as a go-between for Konami and the Spanish developers. The result was a very decent game that, despite seemingly being ignored by a lot of gamers at the time, is actually the most financially successful game in the series' entire history. And for the final game, I could have looked at Lords of Shadow 2, but why look at the sad demise of the series? Instead, let's have a butchers at a computer game version. And it was going to be the Amiga port of the first game, but it's flippin' atrocious. So instead, here's a game that even many long-time fans have only heard about in whispers as the stuff of legend. Well, it's not a myth. It is Castlevania for the Sharp X68000, or more specifically, the PS1 re-release known as Castlevania Chronicles. And yeah, I know this sells for a pretty penny on eBay, but I was surprised how few people I talked to didn't actually know this existed. I mean, I know all my loyal Consoletronicers here watching are aware of it because you're a savvy lot, but this one's seemingly become obscure overnight. And while it's no rival to Symphony of the Night, it's not trying to be. It's a 16-bit remake of the NES original. They've even toned down the difficulty enough so it can be played by mere mortals. Good stuff. Well now, all I can say is I sincerely hope you had as much fun watching as I did playing, because few franchises have been as dear to me as has been the titles that make up the 3 decades worth of Castlevania content across multiple platforms. And while Konami's stock has lowered to the point where some gamers question whether it's right to even go back and play these classics, I'm here to tell you, yes, play them all. And for those wondering why I didn't look at any of the original Game Boy games, Bloodlines or Rondo of Blood, that's because I've already covered them in more depth in videos already, links to which will be on screen soon. And if any of you are feeling the horror bug, I'll also throw up links to recent horror movie reviews from my second channel, Video Holocaust, such as the old Video Nasty Zombie Flesh Eaters and the Gory Gem Reanimator. So, thank you very much for watching. This has been my Castlevania series review. Lots more videos up very soon, so please like, share, subscribe, and tell me your favourite Castlevania games and why in the comments. So until next time, my name's Gray, this has been Consoletronix. Goodbye.